What happens after death? Few questions have followed humanity more stubbornly than this one. It sits at the crossroads of science, religion, fear, memory, and imagination. For thousands of years, people have filled that silence with visions of heaven, underworlds, rebirth, ancestral worlds, and spiritual journeys. But in modern times, the question has changed shape. It is no longer only a matter for priests, poets, and philosophers. It has also become a question for emergency rooms, brain scanners, intensive care units, and researchers studying the final moments of human consciousness. And the deeper science looks, the stranger the edge of death seems to become. The first thing we need to do is separate two ideas that are often mixed together. Death, in medicine, is not usually treated as a single instant with a neat border. It is a process. When the heart stops, blood flow falls, oxygen drops, and the brain begins to lose the energy needed to maintain normal function. Yet that shutdown is not always immediate in the simple way many people imagine. Recent cardiac arrest research, including the AWARE-2 study and later reviews, suggests that some patients who are brought back report episodes of awareness, memory, and vivid experience linked to the period around resuscitation, even when they appeared completely unresponsive from the outside. That does not prove an afterlife. But it does show that the boundary between life and death is more complex, and more biologically dynamic, than older assumptions suggested. This is where the mystery tightens. Across cultures, many people who come close to death describe patterns that sound uncannily similar. They speak of leaving the body, moving through darkness, encountering a powerful light, feeling overwhelming peace, seeing deceased relatives, or experiencing a life review that feels more real than ordinary memory. Scientists call these near-death experiences, or NDEs. A 2025 narrative review and recent scoping reviews note that such reports remain difficult to explain fully with any single theory. Some researchers point toward oxygen loss, abnormal electrical activity, REM intrusion, neurotransmitter surges, memory reconstruction, or the chemistry of a stressed dying brain. Others argue the reports raise harder questions about consciousness itself. The debate is still open, and that is exactly why the subject refuses to disappear. What makes this even more compelling is that the approach of death often changes experience before the final moment itself. Studies of hospice patients show that end-of-life dreams and visions are common, deeply meaningful, and often involve dead loved ones, journeys, or a sense of preparation rather than terror. To families, these moments can seem supernatural. To clinicians, they may reflect a profound psychological and neurological transition. To the dying person, they can feel absolutely real. And that may be the most important place to begin this journey. Before we ask whether death opens a door to another world, we have to understand what happens as the world we know starts to fade. If death is a process rather than a single instant, then the most important question becomes this: what does the brain do as that process unfolds? For a long time, the common assumption was simple. Once the heart stops, the brain shuts down quickly, awareness ends, and whatever follows belongs only to religion or imagination. But modern resuscitation research has complicated that picture. Scientists now know that cardiac arrest does not always erase the possibility of later recalled experience in the immediate way once assumed. In the AWARE-2 study, some survivors of cardiac arrest reported lucid memories and themes associated with consciousness during resuscitation, even though outwardly they appeared entirely unresponsive. Researchers also identified signs of brain activity, including patterns linked in other contexts to conscious processing, during CPR in a small number of patients. That finding does not prove the mind survives death, but it does force science to take the final moments of awareness more seriously than before. This is where near-death experiences become central. These experiences are not just vague stories told after trauma. Many follow recurring patterns across countries, beliefs, and age groups. People describe a sense of separating from the body, observing events from above, moving through darkness, encountering a bright presence, meeting dead relatives, or reliving their lives with extraordinary clarity and emotional intensity. A recent neuroscientific model argues that no single explanation has yet fully accounted for these episodes. Instead, NDEs may involve a mix of brain disinhibition, abnormal sensory integration, memory effects, stress chemistry, and unusual states of consciousness triggered by extreme physiological crisis. In other words, science has plausible pieces of the puzzle, but not the full mechanism. One reason the subject remains so controversial is that the dying brain may not fail in a smooth straight line. In severe oxygen loss, seizures, anesthesia awareness, REM intrusion, and psychedelic states, the brain can generate experiences that feel hyper-real rather than dreamlike. Some researchers think NDEs may emerge from similar mechanisms, especially when normal brain networks lose their balance and hidden patterns briefly surface. Other researchers caution that this still does not explain reports that seem structured, coherent, and deeply meaningful rather than chaotic. The closer scientists look, the less the old idea of death as a simple blackout seems to fit. What makes this more haunting is that people near the end of life often report meaningful visions even without cardiac arrest. Reviews of end-of-life dreams and deathbed visions describe recurring encounters with deceased loved ones, journeys, invitations, and a growing sense of transition. These experiences are often comforting rather than frightening, and they occur in patients who are otherwise cognitively clear. To some observers, this suggests the brain may be constructing a final narrative of passage. To others, it hints that human consciousness may be brushing against something science still cannot measure. Either way, the final threshold appears less like a switch being flipped off and more like a strange and layered borderland between biology, memory, and mystery. Long before modern hospitals began measuring brain waves and resuscitation windows, ancient civilizations were already building entire worlds around the question of what comes next. Death was never just an ending. It was a passage, a judgment, a transformation, or a return. And what is fascinating is that these old beliefs were not random fantasies thrown into darkness. They were organized systems tied to morality, kingship, burial ritual, astronomy, memory, and the survival of identity itself. Archaeology shows again and again that the dead were treated not as vanished people, but as travelers entering another state of existence. That alone tells us something profound about human nature. Across continents and across millennia, people did not merely fear death. They tried to map it. Ancient Egypt offers one of the clearest examples. The famous Book of the Dead was not actually a single fixed book, but a collection of funerary spells and instructions intended to help the deceased survive the dangers of the afterlife and reach paradise. The journey was imagined as hazardous, filled with tests, gates, divine beings, and moral reckoning. The dead person needed knowledge, names, words of power, and spiritual preparation. In other words, survival after death was not treated as vague hope. It was treated almost like navigation through a hidden realm. That worldview shaped burial practices, tomb art, mummification, and the enormous cultural effort devoted to preserving the body and identity after death. Mesopotamia imagined something darker. Britannica notes that Mesopotamian attitudes toward death differed sharply from the Egyptian view and were often grim rather than triumphant. Their underworld was not usually a shining paradise but a shadowed continuation, a place where the dead endured rather than ascended. Even so, the dead still mattered deeply. Rituals for burial, remembrance, and the treatment of spirits revealed the same underlying truth found elsewhere. Human beings could not accept that death was merely disappearance. Whether the next world was glorious, bleak, or uncertain, cultures kept returning to the same conviction that some part of the person continued beyond the grave. This is where ancient belief begins to overlap in a surprising way with modern reports of near-death experiences. A 2025 cross-cultural review argues that NDEs show both diversity and striking similarities across history and societies. The details are shaped by culture, language, and expectation, but recurring themes still appear with remarkable persistence. That matters because it suggests two possibilities, both unsettling. Either human brains under extreme conditions generate similar experiences no matter the culture, or human beings in very different places have been brushing against the same kind of threshold all along. Science has not settled which explanation is correct. But when archaeology, religious history, and modern testimony begin echoing one another, the old question grows larger, not smaller. Death remains the greatest mystery not because we know nothing about it, but because every age seems to discover just enough to keep the door open. So what happens after death? The most honest answer is that science can now describe the approach to death with more precision than ever before, but it still cannot fully explain the fate of consciousness once the body crosses the final irreversible threshold. Researchers can track what happens when circulation stops, when oxygen falls, when brain networks destabilize, and when some patients report vivid experiences after resuscitation. Recent reviews on the dying brain and near-death experiences suggest that these moments may involve a complex cascade of neurophysiological changes rather than an immediate blank shutdown. At the same time, none of this amounts to proof that awareness continues in some independent form after biological death. What science has done is not close the mystery, but sharpen it. The line between living consciousness and dying consciousness is no longer as simple as a light switched off in an empty room. That uncertainty is exactly why the subject remains so powerful. If the evidence clearly proved an afterlife, the mystery would be over. If the evidence clearly proved that all awareness ends the instant the brain fails, the mystery would also lose much of its force. But the truth sits in a harder place. Studies of cardiac arrest survivors show that a small number report recalled awareness and structured experiences around resuscitation. Reviews of end-of-life dreams and deathbed visions show that many dying patients, including cognitively intact ones, describe meaningful encounters, journeys, and the presence of deceased loved ones. These findings can be read in different ways. A skeptic may see a brain under stress creating one final, consoling narrative. A spiritual believer may see the first glimpse of another reality. The data itself has not yet chosen sides. And perhaps that is why humanity keeps returning to this question in every era. We are not only trying to discover what death is. We are trying to understand what a human being truly is. Are we only chemistry organized into temporary awareness, or is consciousness something deeper than matter alone can explain? Modern neuroscience has become more sophisticated, but it has also become more humble. The closer it studies the edge of death, the more it encounters phenomena that are real, reported, patterned, and emotionally transformative, yet still not fully understood. Even highly biological explanations often leave the deepest part of the experience untouched, the overwhelming sense many people describe that what happened to them was more real than ordinary waking life. Maybe that is the true ending for now. Death is still the last undiscovered country, but no longer a silent one. Science has begun to hear echoes at the border. History has preserved humanity's oldest maps of that border. And personal testimony continues to fill the darkness with stories no single theory can completely erase. So what happens after death? We do not yet know. But for the first time in history, we can say this with confidence: the final moments may be far stranger, far richer, and far less empty than we once believed.